And that objectification, as we see after, the Brown decision and then the forced integration of things where Black teachers were just like fired and principals, the pipeline destroyed, right? It created a situation where our children were put into these like housed in these places where their teachers don't respect them, don't really know their context, can't speak to what they need in order to survive within this world. But every time we look at history, we actually see that when we have Black spaces that are healing, that are joyful, that are very explicit, that there's something not only like on the surface level, but something deeper down, that you're part of a deeper legacy. And that is not being translated in enough places for our children to actually carry on to tradition that they're a part of.
Yeah, I mean, how could they? Because teacher colleges look like it's actually probably worse than the K-12 space, as far as like 80% white. Teacher prep is maybe 90%, white. So how could it possibly penetrate these bastions of knowledge? But it's knowledge of what? What exactly are you knowledgeable about? What exactly are you an expert at? It ain't how Black kids learn.
It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free. Welcome to another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after this hour with Sharif, El-Mekki, Ish, and me. Brothers, how you doing? The whole world has changed, so I know how you're doing. You guys are excited now, right? Right? You're excited about the election, and you're just ready to get out there. I know you guys are donating money, knocking on doors. You're doing all of it, right? Whole world changed for you, didn't it? What? I mean, can I get a witness? No.
Down the street looks the same. You know what I mean? Like online looks a lot different.
Yeah.
On the ground, not so much. So in the air, yes. In the clouds, it's a very different energy. On the ground, I think 7 people shot.
Wow.
This week at a block party. 3 died. Yeah. 2 of the deceased were brothers.
Wow.
Yeah, it's their grandma has been part of a legend, part of the movement forever. One of the shooters is the grandson of a legend, of an activist forever. So it's we hurting, man. It's but in the cloud, yeah, things look a lot different.
I mean,
on the net,
that kind of puts it in perspective. The way you just said it. I mean, there is excitement, I will say this, about the fact that Biden has dropped out of the race and he has been replaced by somebody that has some energy and some sprightness, some ability. And if I have a smile on my face about it, not forgetting the part that people's material conditions did not change overnight just because somebody decided to run for president and it looks better now. But if I have any kind of excitement about it, is number one, we looked like we were being railroaded into a loss that was going to be very bad for us. And 2, there just seems to be energy around that is making Trump nervous. I mean, there is talk right now that Trump is second guessing his VP choice. And he's thinking about replacing his VP. He's like, well, they got Kamala as the front ticket and she's young and blah, blah, blah. And all I got is you, and nobody like you. So
I hadn't heard that. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
But that's dangerous too, because that might mean like, does he get a Tim Scott? Like, I mean, like, wait, that's,
Well, this is what's so funny. Vivek Ramaswamy
or him, yeah.
He should have been the dude. He should have been the dude. There is nobody more MAGA, more Trump loving, more whatever, and more articulate and more smart than him. It was obviously him. But for some reason, they just passed over everybody of color. All those people that they trotted out there who were going to be the guys that could get them like a broader audience. They just passed all over all of them and went for J.D. Vance. And look what happened. Everybody hates him. Terrible, terrible poll ratings. But anyways, I
thought they liked him. I thought, because he wrote the book and he even had like progressive and liberals reading the book. Like, yeah, we should implement it. Like,
yes.
I remember that was like the rage. I'm like, I'm not buying that. Like, the hell are y'all talking about?
Hillbilly elegy.
And stop acting like only white people live in rural areas. Like, that's the biggest, like, annoying commentary is like, when you talk about rural, you're only talking about, white folks and hillbillies. And like, nah, like there's plenty of Black folks, Latinos who live in rural areas who actually have things to say. So you should listen, but don't just make it about listening to more white people. You know what they think already. Trust.
Yeah. And I just want to add, Ramaswamy had Ann Coulter on his show, and she says, "Oh, I agree with everything you say, bro. But I
Except,
would never vote for you because you're now basically a white person."
yeah,
So the
she's
Republican Party base, they're very clear about who they targeting. And JD Vance, with his all white imposition of what everybody in rural America looks like and is a reflection of that. And it's a shame, quite frankly, but it should be a naked shame for folks. Folks should be able to see it blatantly and be like, the emperor has no clothes, bro.
I feel like we're getting closer to that now. Then
you
closer
think
than we've
so?
been in a long time. Yeah, than we've been in a long time. I think that I had said this a couple years ago that their whole juggernaut is going to be short term. You can only live off of hate fuel for so long before people start losing interest. It's like, I don't want to wake up hating every day. And now the polls are even starting to show that people are just kind of like, of course, the crazies are always going to be there with you, like the night of the living baseheads. They're always going to come out wherever you go, be with
Night
you,
of the Living. Yo, yeah, I'm
whatever,
gonna have to watch
you
that
know.
video.
Night of the living baseheads, that's what he's got with him right now. But for normal people, it's starting to wane. They really hate JD, and I love what you two just said, because when that hillbilly elegy came out a few years ago, I remember liberals reading it and being like, we have to really just understand their economic insecurity and blah blah blah, and that's what makes them Klansmen. We were like, really? We were like, really? Goddamn, really? That's what makes them the Klan? Something feels wrong about that. And then we have people in education world, in ed world, saying, well, I mean, maybe we should give up on some of this equity stuff and start paying attention to these guys because they have it bad too, and blah, blah, blah. And then they all went on that Trump train. And now they're all going to crash that train right into the river. And I am going to applaud from the bank and be like, y'all went in the river. Hercules. Anyways, appreciate y'all brothers coming together on a Friday again. Today, what I really want us to talk about is Sharif, something that you're involved in, and Ish, something that you have been involved in. In Philly, there is an effort to teach the community and teach first teachers, which are parents, and teach students to really take the literacy, acquisition of literacy into their own hands, to not wait for somebody else. We can educate any child, is what Ronald Edmonds told us years ago. Wherever we choose and whenever we choose, we can educate any child. So if it's not happening, it means that we're not doing it. What I love, Sharif, about this, it's called Right to Read Philly. So people should look it up. Go find the link. What I love about it is that it is it's accessible, and it's something you put into the hands of actual community members like a weapon. Like, this is, here's your weapon for literacy, to cut down on illiteracy, and not have to wait. And I want to turn over to you to tell us more about like the campaign itself, and how it's going and everything. Before I do, I just want to tell this story that we've all told before on this show, which is when in Cuba, they were in the same situation years ago, and Castro knew that illiteracy would kill a new country, and they didn't wait. They deputized people to be reading practitioners, kind of like you have nursing practitioners, and they sent them out to the countrysides and sent them out like a blanket literacy army, basically, and raised the literacy of an entire country well, I don't know how long it took, but in amount of time where they became very literate as a country, which is really interesting to me, because here we are in 2024 still talking about literacy across one of the wealthiest countries in history, right? So anyways, I'll turn it over to you fellas. Ish, you've participated. Sharif, you're in the middle of this campaign. Tell us more about it. What's going on?
Yeah, and your Cuban point, I think last time I looked at it was like 98, 99% literacy rate in their
Damn.
country. Right.
Damn.
And people are like, oh, well, that's small. It's Spanish. It's like they'll come up with a lot of like weird stuff, but like that has nothing to do with it. Like, it's the proactive, it's the elevation of the importance, being on one page. And, so, but anyway, yeah, this right to read Philly campaign has been really exciting. It's with our long partners. Over a decade now with Mighty Engine, Dr. Hisong Sung, who's a psychologist. That was her. That's what her D is in. And she's part of, and we're part of this. Basically, this effort, this is a city effort, Read by Fourth, meaning read by fourth grade. So you can see readbyfourth.org. And it's a coalition of organizations that were all committed to improving literacy. And they did this in different ways. They had reading captains in neighborhood. You have like a block captain. Well, that on that same kind of venue, it's a reading captain, right? And so this person is like helping in the community and thinking about different ways, and they get trainings and they get materials and supports. And it's also tied to the free library, one of Chris's favorite institutions, the free library. So the free library is like the hub for the Read by Fourth Coalition. But one of the things that they found was like it was still a lot of like nonprofits and institutions, and but they're like, but we're not getting to families and giving them, as you said, the tools. So it was a campaign, it was marketing, it was resources, or hosting different things. They're like, they started thinking about like, wait a minute, how do we make sure like families are aware, and not just when we do a resource block, we come to somewhere, we have a festival, we got a table. How else do we like galvanize families where they can see and tie it back to Black history? Wait a minute, what were Black families doing in the 60s and the 70s when they were saying, hey, we're going to take ownership of this space, meaning our child's brains, our child's development, our community activism. And so drawing from that, and they've team, it's funny because they termed it like porch lessons or freedom schools. This is the same, just sometimes you got to reach back and see what were people doing and then apply it to the context of today. So you think about Mississippi, when you think about SNCC, you think about Black Panther liberation schools, you think about the independent Black school movement, you think about whether it's the Nation of Islam or churches saying like, we're going to teach our own. And then we kind of got away from it and jumped into institutions head first and forgot about the back part. So this is that opportunity to, reach back and see how were Black communities teaching their own children, who was the community teacher, right? And so getting more community teachers, but also arming it with a little pedagogy too.
How were they teaching it? Like, what did we lose?
Yeah, I mean, we lost so many things. One, just the connectivity to the actual context that they were operating in, right? So you see a book now in a typical school, it may be talking about things that kids aren't relevant to children, aren't connected to history. It's only white people voices, white people's pictures, white people's history, all these kind of things, where they were like grounding in, okay, what does it mean in our context? A small example, when I remember I did a workshop for somebody because they were reading the Watsons Go to Birmingham, right? Famous book in our community and in the country, really. But there was a white teacher who was teaching it and never mentioned sundown towns, never mentioned, the Green Book, never mentioned any of the things, the creativity of the mom saying, well, we're going to stop here and then we're not going to stop here. Then we're going to get gas from here, but we're not going to, right? Like all those kind of things are part of the context. And that's just the kind of oppressive side, but then also the joy side. What does it mean to be joyful, to be happy, to feel loved, to feel embraced, to be excited about learning, it reminds me of so many of these kids, I'm visiting a freedom school. So many kids, when they're doing this sharing circle, they're like, freedom schools is the best school ever. And, Dr. Carr says, one day, we got to keep fighting where we can drop freedom from it and all schools feel the way that freedom schools feel. And that's kind of like what these community teachers were bringing, to the table.
Yeah, man. Do you mind if I veg you back off of that real quick?
Jump in, man.
I definitely need to uplift the work that Dr. Goldie Muhammad did around this, right? Black literary societies.
Black
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And criticality and like recognizing when folks like after enslavement period, even like during when people were actually living in free states, right? They were actually engaged in reading the text, but reading the world and being critical and looking at it from several different ideas and lenses. And that allowed people to contextualize the reality and take the knowledge that they're getting in that shared learning experience and share it with one another. And that's a tradition. I just finished James Anderson's book, Education of
Yay.
Blacks. Yeah, in the
Welcome
South.
to our side, bro. You know what I mean? I'm still shocked that you had read that,
Me too.
a few years ago.
I mean, it's brilliant because it even talks about at the end of slavery, these people went, the Freedom Bureau went into the rural South to like give folks an education and everything. Black people already had
They got there like, yo, they already got schools.
They already got schools.
We got the train, took us a week to get down here, and they already learning.
And that like speaks to a long tradition of Black folks in this country, regardless of what the conditions were, the desire to learn, to read, to share those experiences with one another, and recognizing that that had something to do beyond just like freedom, but freedom of the mind. And that element, I think, as institutions, as folks integrated into a burning house, I think that that has been lost. That value placed on it. So, like this type of program, and also just kind of the work like Dr. Goli Muhammad is doing, what like tons of other folks are doing, and looking at this past and reaching back and realizing, no, there is a long tradition. Who are we mimicking when we're thinking about what education really is? And I think that's the fundamental question that folks really need to start thinking about. And Dr. Wade Nobles, who's a psychologist, wrote this brilliant article about kind of like educational psychology. And I'm just going to quote it, one thing from it real quick. In a society defined by white supremacy, educational systems grounded in racial objectification would be, by definition, designed be incapable of educating those considered racially inferior. It is obvious to me that psychology has been instrumental in the success of education to not educate Black children. Psychology is pivotal to the project of education. It is not the way that in which psychology defines and extrapolates the issues of normativity, intelligence, achievement, motivation, almost all the processes of education. So basically, as our children are put into these systems and structures by folks who look down on them, who pathologicalize who they are, we're creating conditions. How could those children actually learn under those conditions? But there's evidence throughout history in America that as Black institutions, Black educational spaces of multiple age groups, you actually see real education happening. And that's why within a generation after the enslavement period, you had a large amount of folks become literate in a short amount of time.
So say more about that. If you're in a system of racial or social, I don't know, what was it, white supremacy,
Yeah.
and you're being racially objectified, make that point again, because I'm trying to get my mind around. I feel like that's something we better remember this part. So
Yeah.
so say more about that.
And who it was by again? I missed the name.
Oh, yes. Dr. Wade Nobles and his wife, Zetha Nobles. And they wrote this article piece. And basically, they're going through the intellectual genealogy of educational psychology. So John Dewey's mentor, who was the first educational psychologist, grew up in the South during slavery, viewed Black people in that way, and developed educational psychology through that lens. So through that lens, how educational processes work for Black children within those structures by folks who view them that way makes it impossible, he argues, to really truly educate those children, because basically they're reinforcing the ideas and the lens in which they already see their children. And by default, that is being implied explicitly and implicitly within the educational structure, which probably leads to alienation, disillusionment, like not wanting to be involved, recognizing something's wrong, but not knowing what to call it. And that objectification, as we see after, the Brown decision and then the forced integration of things where Black teachers were just like fired and principals, the pipeline destroyed, right? Jim Crow's pink slip, that's what I'm reading right now. It created a situation where our children were put into these, like, housed in these places where their teachers don't respect them, don't really know their context, can't speak to what they need in order to survive within this world. But every time we look at history, we actually see that when we have Black spaces that are healing, that are joyful, that are very explicit, that there's something not only like on the surface level, but something deeper down, that you're part of a deeper legacy. And that is not being translated in enough places for our children to actually carry on to tradition that they're a part of.
Yeah. I mean, how could they? Because teacher colleges look like is actually probably worse in the K-12 space, as far as like
Mm-hmm.
80% white. Teacher prep is maybe 90%, white. So how could it possibly penetrate these bastions of knowledge? But it's knowledge of what? What exactly are you knowledgeable about? What exactly are you an expert at? It
Yep.
ain't how black kids learn,
Yeah.
live, think, so.
Is there a specific application of this to something that prevents kids from getting literacy? Because it feels like on something like math or something where there's less, I think, objectivity or whatever, it's different. But the things that you put in the hands of kids to learn to read and to read has a context. It has a social and a racial context, whether you want it to or not. It does. And I wonder if there's something about that impacts the ability of children to be fully free to read, to learn to read.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, a couple things, and reading is always complicated, but I would say it applies to math too. But let's start,
Mm-hmm.
but in a different way. But what's a common ground for both of them, where kids are not living up to their potential, learning it at their, the accelerated rate that human beings can actually learn, is low expectations. If I don't really think you can do it, then it doesn't just impact what I'm doing in the classroom. It impacts how I research to prepare the lesson, how I write my lesson plan, and the materials that I use and what I teach. It impacts the questions, right? So if you're talking about intellectual rigor, even for a child, like what does it mean to get them to think? I'm not going to push you to think. I'm not even going to really think that you can think at deeper levels. So what I'm giving you is always going to be far beneath what your capacity is. And the more you do that, like as you know, I raise like snakes and I used to raise alligators. If the tank that you put them in, it impacts the size that they grow to.
That's a good point.
Right, it impacts. So if I
Yeah.
have a 10-gallon tank and that's what I'm raising my rat snake in, that has an impact on how large that snake will grow. If it's larger, then they'll just yeah. You're not down with rat snakes?
Why are you
What is
raising rat snakes, bro?
yeah.
Like, what is wrong with you? Like, are you okay? Should we do a wellness check?
Yo, that's part of my what do they call it? Like, my healing, it's like holding my snake and, like
But you just made
decompressing
a
and
deep
stuff.
point. I don't want to derail it because you made a deep point.
Yeah.
The size of the tank. I mean, yeah, I used to have a version of that years ago when I would talk about the shoes that they would put on Chinese women in some places.
Right. Yes,
And
yes.
your feet just conform. Like,
Yeah.
the shoes aren't big enough, but they conform. And
And
eventually your
deform.
feet, they
And
deform.
deform.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I
Wow.
think, we
Yeah.
often talk about this,
Wow.
the Carter G. Woodson quote when it's thinking about adults. I think we should actually think about it around children, where it's like, what, if you're accustomed to being sent through the back door, then even if there is no back door, you would build one. I want us to think about that in the context of the psychological development of a Black child. If you're constantly given low level stuff, if you're constantly kind of, derailed from the, like the more intellectual thinking, if you're constantly not in those spaces, not only what you experience, but also what you see. When I taught an adjunct professorship at Temple, I had a lot of, mostly white students. It was in my class when they were like, "Oh, is that why all the my classmates, they were always in home ec when we were in AP courses?" And these were from, a lot of them were Pennsylvania, but they were in like other counties and towns. And but they said it didn't really strike them until we were engaged in learning, about in the course. And they were like, "Oh, now we see." Like they're seeing it, but guess who else is seeing it? The Latino classmates. And what does that mean to
Yeah.
them? And then later their children, unfortunately, if they don't break out of that, push out of that.
Mm-hmm. And those things are internalized even
Exactly.
subconsciously, right? Like, and if you're not being kind of guided to the water, or even like being given the tools to understand what you're experiencing from a young age. I mean, the doll test. is a perfect example of like something of some of those effects that a child can even write their name, but they can tell you the black doll is dumb and ugly and the white doll smart and pretty. And they prefer that. That's a real thing, man. That still goes on. That still affects our children. So, like, I also, side hustle at University of Penn, an Ivy League school, and the graduate program for children people who are going to be teaching children in urban settings. And I can tell you, doing it for 3 years now, these are the first time these folks are even exposed to any of these ideas of questioning the way they have been taught. And you're telling me you're 25 years old in graduate school at an Ivy League and you never heard this before? And think about it, they go into these schools, they teach children, and they perpetuate. And it really doesn't matter your racial or ethnic identity. If you can never admit that Black people were never meant to be free, you hold anti-Black views, and that is going to be manifested. So, like, I think the cage metaphor and even the shoes, the deformity that happened to Chinese women's feet, that is an exact example or a metaphor to what a lot of our children are facing when they're trying to go through these systems and structures, and nobody sits them down and explains to them how to navigate and how to make sense out of all the nonsense that they're being told about themselves their whole lives through media, through how their teachers even treat them. Like, I've had a teacher tell me before, oh yeah, we don't read or write that much because the kids don't like it. So we like look at things and talk. I'm like, what? But that's a reality. And that's more of the norm than folks who are actually doing the hard work of not only unlearning for themselves, because a lot of us need to do that, but also stepping into the classroom, looking at the children as these people have a full potential to actually be much larger than what our society tells them they can be.
All right. So I want to I want to have you guys play advocate. I'm not going to say, none of us want to play Beelzebub advocate because all of us come from a tradition where that's death. We don't want to do that. But let me run something by you, and then you guys respond as the rightful advocates, right? So there's way to learn to read that doesn't require any of the cultural knowledge or background. You need knowledge rich, context setting backgrounds to be able to access text and read. And that doesn't have to be cultural, except for it has to be part of the larger culture. So for instance, the larger cultural knows things about Shakespeare and knows things around like the Great Depression or the common things that came out of, the United States. There's this world fund of information, and it's not African American, and it's not this, that, or the other. So when it comes to literacy acquisition or reading, learning to read, there is a science that basically says it's not about the culture of what I'm putting in your hands. It's not about any of that. It's just about you having a world fund of information that allows you to access the most common text. Meaning, if you're going to be an American, there's Sharif, I have talked about this. There's a canon. There's just things that you're supposed to know. There's stuff in The Great Gatsby, because if you don't know that, you might go to a cocktail party at some point in your life, and everybody there will have known that, and you won't know it.
I never read that.
What's
Just
that?
to be clear, I never read that. Just to be clear,
Me either.
You don't know about West. You don't know about West Egg. Come on,
and we're
y'all.
fine. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, I never read that.
I don't know if I'm doing fine, but there's a lot of
stuff in the white canon
read, so,
that I've never read.
But I guess the point that I'm making is attack that idea. Attack the idea that it's really about a science when it comes to reading. It's not about I can hear some people in my head who are very culturally insulated on the white side of things, and they don't think any of this matters that we're talking about right now.
Oh yeah,
just teach them to read. You can just teach them to read with the actual canon and all this, cultural stuff or whatnot. It's just it's a way to get around just teaching them what they need to know or something like that. I don't know. You've heard some version of this. I just put that out for you guys. Tell me what's wrong with that.
Yeah, go ahead. Ish, you want to start?
I mean, I just want to start by saying, like, the way they frame against it is like, oh, you're teaching wokeness, or you're teaching them emotional stuff, and you know what I mean. And I just think of Memorani, it's like it's completely irrational for you to be rational all the time. But I digress. When we're talking about what children are getting and how this society shapes it, the mind is something that is very like expanding and can connect many dots. Now, if you're connecting dots without the certain amount of information to make sense out of the context you exist in and why things are, I mean, I just said it before. Regardless of your racial or ethnic identity, you start be like, in our society, reinforce that idea is like, what's wrong with those people? Why can't they get their lives together? And children and families internalize that. And then they're unable to make sense out of this society. I put it in the box. Lauryn Hill in her song Black Rage has a great line that says, life outside of context is living ungodly. It's like, how can you even like make sense if you're not given those cultural things? And I would even make a bigger case that the Black educational traditional models of, teaching, I think they're much more highly effective. When we're talking about Eurocentric structures and Western canon and everything, those things aren't even good for themselves. You know what I mean? Like the ideas are stagnant. They're actually very, individualistic and look at things in a very objectified way instead of the interconnectedness and the universality of our existence, all connected. And I know that's like going real deep and philosophical with it, but I get
No,
very,
it's not.
very
It's
concerned.
Yeah, it's practical. Like not understanding, like how we are on the earth is why the earth is suffering the way it is. Like we forced on it because things are isolated from. So we see one thing, we don't believe the connectivity, right? Like when the indigenous population was first interacting with white settlers, they were saying like, "Yo, this is all connected," and the white folks like, "Nothing's connected. Oh, you guys are just so primitive." Now people are going back. White folks are going back and making money off. Like, hey, they were right. They won't state that, but they're just like, hey, our company looks at the whole right because that's actual education. This is all connected. What you do on land will impact the water. What you do in the water will impact the air. And it just keeps going back. Like that is part of the learning. But say, if I even put away the relationships, the trust, all of those things, pedagogy demands any pedagogy, good pedagogy, psychology, human growth and development demands that you help the brain connect dots, make connect. That's how the learning happens. The synapses occurs when there's new learning. It has to connect. It's almost like a magnet. It has to connect with prior knowledge, background knowledge, prior knowledge. That is what facilitates learning. So if you come in and you can't access prior knowledge and background knowledge because you have no idea about the culture of the people you're teaching. As a matter of fact, you have contempt for the people, so you can never learn the culture. Because anything you think you understand, you're actually misunderstanding. And now you're trying to teach. It defies the logic. It defies the proven a million times over premise of what it takes to learn, and particularly what it takes to learn at accelerated rates that human being brains can actually do. Because it's like trying to do something and defying gravity. You know what I mean? And yeah, some kids will learn. Like, somebody once gave the analogy of like, oh, lift one foot up. Just hold one foot up. Like, yeah, some kids will still matriculate through. Now, while you got that one foot up, lift the other one up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen, right?
If it does, I'm leaving you. If you succeed at that, just so you know, I'm leaving the room. um, so something you just said I thought was interesting, because if you have contempt for the culture and others, you'll never see what's useful about them yourself that you could be missing. You always feel so superior that you will be missing the point, which is, you know what, there might be something. Like before we had aspirin, we had a root that we use. And to your point that you made, Sharif, then they will go discover that root and give it to big pharma, package it and put it out in the world and pretend like it's theirs. Right.
Yeah.
And my root,
the Columbus
when I'm talking about
syndrome. We
what I'm
discovered
talking
this.
about, and it's their way of building empire. That's the way a whole empire was built. It looks like theirs, but it really is what they've collected from peoples all over the world and then called theirs, like repackaged it and relabeled it. That's the number one skill of empire: going places and being like, "Oh, I like that. I made it." Like, like, "Oh, you have medicine? Oh, cool. now it will be mine, and I will take credit for making it. But the root thing the point that I'm making is this song. You told me a while ago that the way that you learned the alphabet song when you were coming up in your school is different than the way that I learned it. Now I learned it in the Empire way, right? Like the kind of mainstream way, right? So I'm an empirist, right? Like I got like
you learned the names of the letters.
the names of the letters, but okay. So mostly we all did, but did anybody ever stop to say, there might be another way to teach this?
Yeah.
Did anybody ever think for years and years and years? Did anybody say, well, I know it's been this way forever, but teaching kids the names of the letter rather than the function of the letter or the sound of the letter actually keeps them one step removed from actually knowing what do these letters do? So anyways, explain this part to me, because I don't feel like I'm articulating
No, I
well
think
what it is, but
I think you are. I think, and it goes back to your earlier point, Chris, around like what do people who are conscious and critical, what do they bring to the table? So like in the Freedom School tradition, one of those things is training your replacement. Like that's everyone's responsibility. When you talk about like, hey, don't just mentor, be a sponsor. Being a sponsor means you're actually training your replacement, right? Like it's a elevated level, right? And so teachers are that, but there's many teachers, principals, educators, whatever. They don't look at their children as their replacements. They have the opposite. You will not replace us. That's a very different like framework, mindset, and way of thinking and way of teaching. Where the Black folks like, hey, I need you to be in this and actually in an elevated status, right? I need you to be my boss, right? Like, I tell my students like, hey, one day they were like, oh yeah, one day I'm gonna work for you. I'm like, no, one day I hope you allow me to work for you. That's like, and that's how I want to approach an education. There are others who are like, hey, like it don't matter, just get a job, just like whatever. Like they work at a gas, they don't care, as far as like they're not thinking about training their replacement. And so I would say for the letters, this goes back to, what you all have all talked about, what James Anderson and many others have talked about. Like, hey, I remember reading a story where Black folks, they were allowed to listen to certain, speeches about Bible passages, right? Go to church, hear certain things. Afterwards, they would try to connect the words with a letter they just saw somewhere, just like, wait a minute, which one? All right, like, piecing it together, which has to be so painstakingly hard to learn how to read in that way. But they were doing it. They were doing it through all of that. But at some point, people also started saying like, okay, this phonics piece, this understand, which is also was more nationwide before it got hijacked and went all the way to the other side. Like more people were actually doing that, particularly for English because of the complexity of all these words and borrowed and different rules and blah blah blah. So this how we learned it as 3 and 4 year olds. Yeah, we learned the names of the letters A, B, C, D, like most people do. It's hard to not learn that, just being in the space. But as 3 year olds, as 4 year olds, we learned in our community the phonetic soundings of these, which went abacada, efaga, haijaka, lamina pa, quarasata, avawa, za, ya, za. And while we were learning that, it was connected to other things. So they would say, and I'm going to do this with you too, like, okay, Chris and Ish, we're going to say the word the. Say the.
Tehi. Tehi.
Okay,
Tehi.
Chris. Very good, Ish. Ish, can you say that again for Chris?
The.
Ish and Chris, where do you think your tongue is when you say the? Feel that. Say it slower. And then tell me, where's your tongue in your mouth when you say the?
Top of your mouth.
It's kind of like at the front of your mouth. Yeah.
Top.
Yeah, but and imagine a 3-year-old, they're actually practicing it. They're putting it there and they're like, sound it out, right? Like, and so we're doing that with words. We have, we want to do blended sound. So they're putting it together and then they're using it. Okay, AT, we know like, oh, that's at. UT, that's ut. IM, that's M. And then when they're putting another letter in front of it. Like, so we have the alphabet, we have our tongue and mouth placement, and we're doing blended sound, right? Like this was a whole thing that we were doing on somebody's porch. It wasn't my school teacher. It wasn't that. It was an indoor porch. Dr. Suzette Abdul Hakim. And it wasn't just me and my cousins, her kids and her sisters and her brother's kids. It was kids from the neighborhood. But the interesting thing is like, so we thought that was like isolated. Me and my cousin, sometimes we talk, we still know the song, blah, blah, blah. I saw somebody randomly on the street who was younger than me, but I was like, she's like, hey, I heard that on the radio. That's how I learned too. Like, so she's talking about, so these were happening in our communities. Where it was marrying the names, but also the sounds. And then you add that to training your replacements. You add that to say like, hey, you're like, you're not bloodline, but you're like my child. You're my child. I'm part of your elders, and we're part of this together. So it was the ownership. It was also the joy. It was so much fun. I have such fond memories as a 3-year-old and 4-year-old getting together and doing this and in community. It was joyful.
That's
When
the
you
big
juxtapose that to others who are like, I hate school,
my big aha with the Right to Read Philly thing is how important communal learning is. How important community is in this. We've been saying it in different variants and years, but this campaign in Philly is so straight up. It's like it's a communal learning. It's community based. That's the solution. It's been the solution for years. It's phonics based or whatever. And the thing I love about it is it cuts right through all of the noise that has been created for years with balanced literacy and formalized ignorance and the way that the system has really kind of created a problem. It's hard to say, well, what would the solution be to that, except to say, let's go right to the people. Let's tell them, like, listen, bottom line, phonics is what needs to happen here. It always was. And they, that other group took you on some long 30-40 year juggernaut onto something different, but let's get back to the basics here. You can learn to read, you can teach to read as a community, right? That to me feels indigenous. It feels feels like the peoples of the worldish. It feels, it's not a Western way of looking at things. The Western way of looking at things is sitting in a row in a desk, compartmentalized. The unit of change is the individual, all of that. And that has never really worked for us, right? That has never been our strength. So I don't want to keep talking about it. I think it's so brilliant that I encourage everybody to, number one, to go look at this. Tell me about the Freedom School connection to this campaign, and what came out of Freedom Schools that fuels this campaign.
Yeah, so Dr. Carr would say that when we think of Freedom Schools, we often think very explicitly about SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But he said you should really consider Freedom School any place that people were getting together to teach each other. He's like, that's the concept of Freedom School. He's like, while they named it that, he's like, that's been any time. During enslavement, post-enslavement, any of those times when it was resisting against the structure of, laws to make you to keep you illiterate, the structures to underfund, the structures to close your school, all of those things. Anytime you're getting together, organizing and teaching the next generation or your peers, that's Freedom School. So the concept of it is, Freedom Schools, there was so many variants of it after SNCC kind of went down and did that. Remember, they did that very explicitly in Mississippi. But from that, it inspired so many other movements. Like I said, Nation of Islam had schools, churches had schools. In a broad context, most of those could be considered some version of Freedom Schools. You had independent Black school movements, and many of them, like Nathal Musasa, the one I went to, it was called the African Free School. It was a freedom school. It was just full blown, year round, K6. But the name of our school was Nathal Musasa, the African Free School. And so you had a lot of those. And so those pedagogical frameworks that people were working on and developing, that's where they were, because they couldn't go into, the school. Remember, a lot of these Black teachers were fired anyway, or wouldn't be hired. So where were they going? People who were interested in it, they were going into these other spaces that they had a level of autonomy. They also had a level of protection and support, and also understanding of what they were trying to accomplish. If you took some of this to a traditional school, Not, I mean, even just having black, there were people who saying like, oh no, black people never did that. Oh, that's no such thing. Oh, there is no such thing as black authors or black poet, right? Like they had the same kind of mindset that what Thomas Jefferson had for Phyllis Wheatley, right? Like you actually have no real contributions, right? And everything that we're describing, we're putting in a black child context. We have to remember this is what they felt about their own kids and learning. When Thomas Jefferson said, like, it's basically talking about public schooling, he's like, well, most of the kids are rubbish. Let's get a couple gems out of that. He wasn't even talking about black kids. They hadn't even made it onto the educational hierarchy yet to even be considered. And when he's talking about rubbish, he was referring to his own children. He's talking about white children, and he already called them rubbish. Now, he enslaved and raped people. So if his children were rubbish, what were they? They didn't even make it to rubbish status. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about education now, the context of educating the masses. Yeah. So that's how like deep all of this really goes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to say, like, education is a socialization process. It's learning. It doesn't have to happen in a building. It doesn't have to happen it can happen anywhere. Our children engage in it at lunchtime when they're talking about whatever happened during the day, right? They're involved in dialogue and inner subjectivity about like, oh, I'm listening to you. I'm making sense out of it. I'm taking it in consideration. You're doing the same, right? And all these processes is just part of it all. And so when we box it, when we put it into the way it's operating, it actually creates what Sharif just described, a situation where it just exists that's not even good for their own children, let alone for our children. So I just definitely want to have to, but if your child goes to like a very wealthy private school, they are kind of getting that. The white kids there are kind of structured in circles, reading books, talking with each other, laid back environments. And I can tell you that because I have children, my oldest goes to Philadelphia Public School High School. I have another child that goes to a friend's private school, Quaker school, who's having that experience. I have a child, my youngest goes to an African-centered independent school who also kind of gets that level of experience. And then my third child actually goes to a middle school, public school in Philadelphia. And we
Shout out to parental choice.
Yeah. Listen, 4 different schools, bro. And all this speaks, so like to see it from that angle and then to think about the socialization process and then even deconstruct that with them as they're going through it. It has illuminated some things that I didn't even know about through my own experience. And I think that at the end of the day, when we're talking about how we're socializing our children, what values we want to instill, what we want them to place importance on, the destructive nature of this society and the values that this society makes, which is unsustainable, that are killing the world, killing each other, creating more conflict. I think at the end of the day, folks are going to go back, like you said, Chris, at the beginning, to these indigenous ways of knowing, of socializing with one another, teaching the skills and the things that we need in order to survive in this world, and actually be able to give the tools necessary for our children to imagine something outside of what currently exists. And as long as we're stuck into this cycle of just trying to fit within, to get a good job, to follow the rules, to be compliant, to go through a whole school year, get an A in the class, but not learn anything, we're going to be stuck in this kind of cycle of futility of trying to get free.
So I have a question around all this for you guys to help me with. So one, you talk about a city no one can read, and we will say our kids can't read. None of our kids can read, right? So I have a couple of questions about that. Why can't your kids read? Like there's an answer to this, right? Like what happened? Like help me do the forensics on this, right? So that's one thing is like, we think that's the end of the conversation when we say our kids can't read. And I think that therefore the schools are failing, or therefore teachers are failing, or therefore we're failing. But we never really diagnose, like say, well, goddamn, if a whole city worth of kids are not reading, why is that? Now, let me add this other part for you two, because then you say, well, we need culturally responsive learning. So that sounds like, okay, so I'm going to go to the Bronx and we look in the face of some kids that have very low reading proficiency. And I'm going to say to them, well, Mali was one of the most rich kingdoms ever in the world. And they're going to be like, yeah, that's cool. That's interesting. But I still can't read. Oh, okay. Well, you know that, there was a lot of math and science that went into building the pyramids.
That-
Okay, that's cool. I still can't read it. Keep telling me about it. Right. So
Chris, you're terrible.
I have
So
to do this because I think it provokes thought.
no,
It
it
provokes
is.
thought, right?
I mean,
Yeah.
it's funny and sad because there are actually there are some folks who are not teaching, but they got a poster of Malcolm X on their wall, right? So that's the same
Right.
kind of thing. They got Malcolm, and I'm like,
Right.
how you teach is the exact opposite of what Malcolm stood for. So
Yes.
there are a couple things, and I think it's very important that in this space that we uplift and ground, and people need to actually when you're talking about like what should be on people's minds and bookshelves is things like Gloria Ladson Billings' work. Right, this is the 30th anniversary of the publication of her book Dream Keepers, and one of the things she's talking about, like, it's not culturally competent if it doesn't have intellectual rigor. It's not culturally competent. It's an incompetence. If you're saying, "Oh, I'm culturally competent," and you're saying things, but it has nothing to do with academic excellence and achievement, it's cultural incompetence, right? So they have to be tied together. So yes, if you're talking about Mali, can they read the word Mali? Can they read the word Mansamu? Right? Like there are other things that are still the foundation. And again, back to the mindset. We always talk about mindset, skill, and will. The mindset, yes, you want to make sure that you are respectful, you have a level of cultural humility, blah, blah, blah. That's because you can now till the soil. Right? I can't, I'm a gardener. I can't plant the seeds until I till the soil. Like I got to break that up. That's the mindset. That's the fertile ground, right? It needs certain things. So does the mind in order to prepare and to deliver instruction, right? And so that piece about like man, someone's like that is important. And you're right because they're getting a counter narrative like y'all don't care about learning. Y'all don't like well, Timbuktu is actually the oldest library in the world, right? Or I believe, or one of the oldest, right? So to be able to say that to a child and they understand that and you're teaching them, you're countering all of the socialization. It doesn't just happen in schools. It also happens media, social media, environment. So they're socializing them to, like Malcolm said, who taught you to hate yourself? So they're being socialized really to hate themselves. And if you hate yourself, why would you care about learning? Why would you care about your community? Why would you care about leading if you hate yourself? So when you're teaching, you're actually doing double duty. That's why it's so beautiful when it's done well, because the socialization both inside the school and outside. So when if we're grounded, if Gloria Ladson Billings' work is anchoring, and Lisa Delpit, if her work is anchoring, and Goldie is anchoring, and Zaretta Hammond is anchoring our learning, right? Then that's a different context. So they're talking about this literacy piece, and they're approaching it from a very, very different angle. But I would say parallel to that, Chris, and all of this, yes, this needs to be most of our teacher prep program, where a person says, I want to be a teacher, then they go to school, they're not teaching them how to teach kids how to read. And principals aren't when I got my principal certification, there wasn't a single sentence about here's how you support teachers in helping kids how to read. This is things I learned on the job and through, practice and through professional development. I didn't learn it at the place I was paying for, and neither are teachers. So when you're talking about like 3 million teachers and a significant number of them don't enter the field knowing how to teach kids how to read, let alone kids who need differentiated instruction, need extra support, need interventions, they're not learning the basic way. That is the foundation, right? But then teaching kids how to read also means that the mindset attached to the skill. They're not even teaching the skill, and many of them don't have the mindset. You combine that, that's why our kids can't read.
Hmm. I think it's
And
so
some kids
interesting.
will learn how to read despite all of that, right? So that's
Well, I
like the
think people
crazy
count on
part.
that. I think people count on that happening. Like, let's just put them in the woods and they'll figure out the alphabet. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, that's not how you learn to read, homie. I don't know what kind of plan you're thinking of, but that's not it. So there's two elements to to that last point. The first one is low proficiency rates across the country of African Americans. You can be in Baltimore, you can be in Chicago, you can be in Seattle, you can be in San Francisco, you can be in Austin, right? Like you could be anywhere and have a same scenario, like in terms of performance, like achievement, outcomes, whatever. So to me, that feels like that's a us problem. The thing that I love about Right to Read Philly is that it is also a us solution, right? Like if we wait for other people to solve our problem, that's what they call it, the definition of insanity, is to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. I just said it's pretty uniform across, cities, across places where we exist. So when I say it's a us problem, I don't mean we created the problem. I just mean that we're the ones that is tasked with solving it, because if we don't, the world is going to keep doing to us what they do. So when I hear we can't read or my kids can't read, what I want to hear after that is a plan for what your pastors are going to do, what your barbershops are going to do, what your sororities and your Jack and Jills and all that stuff I always talk about, right? I want to know, like stop talking crap, because literacy is the gateway drug to all learning in my mind. So if we're failing in that situation, right? Like if we're failing in that situation, then we don't have any other job. That's our only job. That's job one.
Bro, that is the job. And I wish people had matched the energy of getting people to register to vote to getting kids being able to read.
Damn.
Like that's the energy that should be. And I felt like if there's a church, if there's a masjid, if there's any faith-based place that doesn't have some kind of we're teaching children, we're supporting directly the education of children, then it's problematic. That was my mother's, one of her biggest things. She's like, yeah, they'll talk to you about spirituality to death, but they won't teach you how to read. And you're like, that's a no-win situation, right? Because then you can be still easily manipulated because you can't read, right? And then when you said it's a us problem, as soon as you said that, I thought about Stokely Carmichael. He said, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. And right now, our kids are being intellectually lynched. That is our freaking problem.
Well, so many mic drops with that.
Because it pisses me off, man. We too soft about it. Like, I mean, it is like there's not, there's nothing more important, and we do all this stuff and we're running. And I'm like, that's dope that tens of thousands jumped on the line and fundraised and all that kind of stuff. Tens of thousands need to be making sure that these kids are literate.
The revolution,
and we
will
can
be
do
literate.
both. Like, I'm not saying like don't do that, do this. I'm saying do both. One has to stay a constant. It should be part of NAACP's yearly, annual plan and 10-year plan. It should be part of Urban League. Like every single person, every single group, whether it's legacy, whether it's new, literacy should be part of the work. And then you add the other things that you want to do. Do whatever else that you want to do, because it's myriad issues that we got to address. Literacy has to be a part of it.
Yes. And the investment of resources in real terms to even incentivize people to even start that process, because like people do have busy lives and get caught up and they'll take the moment to step out and be like, wait a minute, I should be focused on this, right? And then training programs and really get into communities in real ways and put the power into folks' hands. And after a while, you won't even need to incentivize it. It will be part of the very structure. And I'm very clear that needs to happen and that we need to really be holding ourselves accountable. Sharif, I really appreciate your passion around this, and you need to keep on pushing that line, because if we don't have our children reading, man, and with AI and all the things coming down the pipe, man, we're going to be regurgitating a derivative of derivative that used to be known as the truth, and it's based off of somebody else's truth, not our own.
Bro, some of it, and I'm for like figuring out and learning AI. We did a show about this, like AI, like it's a tool. Every tool can be used for it. You can use a gun to hunt. You can use it to defend. You can use it to go murder someone, right? Like, so it's and I'm not like one of the NRA, blah blah blah, that kind of thing. But it's just saying like any tool, right? Like, so AI is a tool, but if we don't, at some point, folks going to have to go back to books. Right, because if I can right now, I don't know how, but I could have Chris standing up and and speaking on the internet saying, "Yeah, I love JD Vance, and this is why," right? Like, and with his voice.
And for the
You know what I'm
record,
saying?
y'all will always know that's not me. So I just want y'all to always know, you will always know the way you could tell that it's not me is if I say some dumb shit like that, right? That's how you know for sure that it's not me. That is definitely AI. That is government generated.
Imagine 20
This
years
is
from
so
now, where
right.
they don't know you
Well,
and they're
well,
just seeing it, right? But if they go back to your writing and actually
they'll
can
know.
read it, and they have access, right, to something that is, I mean, and then we don't even have to speak about futuristic, even just like right now, like you got to be able to read. Like it's just, oh, this is what I was going to share. So my critique in our own faith with the Muslims, like even during prisoners of war, they could earn their freedom if they taught 10 people how to read.
Mm.
That was
Mm.
the importance. A prisoner of war, you were just trying to kill me. You're captive. Your freedom, it's not like, oh, years in jail. It's not this. Like, teach 10 people how to read. That's your freedom.
If you told me that my freedom was tied up in teaching 10 people to read, they gonna learn to read because or they're gonna die. Like we're gonna have a problem if you don't learn to read. So one or the other. But I want to say three things. So we're at the end here, and I know we're gonna wrap. But you just said I made mental notes on three things. So the first one is about AI, and what I would tell everybody, I just love tools. You said it's a tool. I love tools to do our work. Something called Notebook LM is something that I'm telling everybody about because I think it's so powerful and important. And I don't know how this bridges what you just said, but if you go to Google Notebook LM, you can take, say, for instance, I have whole folders of research. I have folders of research on teacher prep and language acquisition and politics and education. I have all these folders, and in it there's all these PDFs, and you can put all those PDFs into Notebook LM and then ask it questions about what all that research says. It will read all of your PDFs for you and read all your studies with all those Greek letters and everything in it. And then you can ask it questions. What does the research say about, this or that and the other? And it will draw the answer for you from real research. The thing that I love about it is, as a tool, it also will tell you, this is what you should really be asking me, right? Like it'll give you prompts and questions of like, do you want to know about this? And you'll be like, yeah, I do want to know about this other thing that I wasn't even thinking of. So as a tool, think about the fact that you could put in a Baldwin book, James Baldwin, and you can ask it, tell me what the main themes were, tell me what the point of this was, tell me why this writing is good. You can ask it a lot of questions about the book, and it will give you answers that you wouldn't have thought of yourself. So as a tool, I just want to say, like, it can't replace your thinking, but it definitely can accelerate your thinking. Like it can make your thinking bionic. So I just want to put a plug in for culturally relevant AI, culturally useful AI. Everything's a tool for your freedom. I don't care what you put in my hand. If you put a blade of grass in my hand, I have to figure out what that blade of grass is going to do, right? Like for me. And AI is a very powerful one. So I'll just say that on that one thing. This other thing, I don't know if I should even say it because it could be controversial at the end. But
that gives you pause. That gives you pause.
Well, because I don't want to leave it unfinished. But here's the thing. It's not necessarily a racial problem when it comes to this literary situation, and let me tell you why. I just interviewed a very successful dude yesterday who grew up in Chicago. He's much older than I am, and he's very successful. He's done a lot of things in life, but he was telling me about how his counselors were trying to convince him not to go to college because he wasn't college material, and he had a scholarship to West Point and had an offer from Harvard, and he had a counselor, Black folks, telling him, that ain't really for you, type of thing or whatever. So sometimes we can become part of the system in ways as teachers, as educators, and others that are just as much of a problem as anybody else. That doesn't mean that there isn't race in the world. It just means that just because you've said this a lot, Sharif, just because you're a Black teacher doesn't necessarily mean you're a conscious teacher, right? Like there's we got to make sure we have both of those things when we're talking about filling up the pipeline. And then the last thing.
So it means, Chris, it means that it is racism. It is dealing with race. Because it's just internalized racism.
It could be internalized racism, yes.
And
but what
biases, right?
What I don't want people to think is all the white teachers are bad and all the Black teachers are good.
Yes.
because that's going to kill you.
That
That's going to kill you.
100%.
And you know what? There's some
100%.
dope white teachers and there's some trashy black teachers. So I just want to be real about that point, because if you don't know that, when you encounter it, you will be surprised, and you shouldn't be
Listen, my
surprised.
top 10 my top 10 teachers that I've seen, like, that I've actually observed and seen their instruction, their technique, their outcomes, they're white teachers on that list. You
Yeah,
know what I mean? Like,
yeah. And so the last thing I'll say about this too, is just an experience that I had here locally. Is we put up these billboards, not we, actually Dan Sellers, is someone locally who does a lot in education, and there he was part of this campaign to put up billboards that basically said 80% of your kids can't read or whatever. They put up a billboard right outside the office of the superintendent of public schools in Minneapolis. So when she opened her curtains every day, there was this billboard facing right in her window
she
saying,
may not have
you know,
opened her curtains
right, our
anymore.
kids can't read, right? And at some point, he said, you know what, we should expand this a little bit. So it was always black kids on those billboards, but then he put up a billboard that said, Sven and Ola can't read either. Like white kids can't learn either, and that was the most controversial billboard. There
That's when
were some
people
billboard
got
companies that
upset.
wouldn't run it. There were some billboard companies that wouldn't run it because of the message. And the truth was, it's true. White kids are not knocking it out of the park either when it comes to reading. So that means we have a much bigger problem. It isn't just about our kids can't read and their kids can. No. Their proficiency rates and language acquisition is pretty bad too. It may be better than some others, but it's still not out of the woods, which tells me the point you keep making, how we prepare teachers is a universal situation. That's not just about they don't know how to teach black kids. It's they're not being prepared how to teach reading, just in general, right?
Period.
So those are the things I'm going to leave with. I'll drop at the end there. Number one, AI can be a very powerful tool if you use it for the stuff we want to do, right? Two, I think when we talk about training teachers and whatnot, that's not necessarily race dependent, because we have some dope teachers doing things and some not so dope teachers doing things, and they cut across backgrounds and races. I think to be very honest with you, I think one of the biggest problems we have is a class problem. And I rarely say that, because I always think that we have a race problem before we have a class problem. But when it comes to education, we have a middle class uh, workforce working with the working class and underclass audience, right? And I think that brings in a whole bunch of negative stereotypes with it into the classroom and into learning centers, because you have this class difference. I mean, listen, to be a teacher, you have to be college educated. What does that tell you? Like, in terms of like who's teaching our kids,
What's
you
that?
have to
That's
be
the
college
30%.
educated,
What
right?
was that? 30% of the population.
Right. You're kind of elite just by the fact that if you're qualified to be a teacher, you're kind of elite already. You don't feel it because you get paid in beans and rice, but like in general, you are kind of elite, and you're teaching kids who are not there yet. Anyways, that's my soapbox. What do you guys say at the end of this conversation about race, culture, literacy, and how we have community solutions to address our own issue when it comes to literacy? What's your guys' final word?
Yeah. I'll Yeah, I would say, uplifting, what Ish said earlier about the socialization process, and that, people really, and Chris, you talk about like the difference between schooling and education, for, decades now, right? Like, and I think that's important piece. Like, education isn't confined into the schools. You want schools to reinforce, you want the lot, my mom used to say, the reason why she loved Nithamusasa, our elementary school, was because the line between home and school, sometimes that's hyphenated. She's like, it's non-existent, and some people's hyphenated home and school, that hyphen is a mile long. That's the gap between how the home is thinking about education and the aspirations and what the school believes the child is capable of. And for her, she was like, that was a seamless connection. It wasn't hyphenated. It was like one and the same. It was an extension. School is an extension of the home, and the orientation and learning that she wanted us to have. And I think that is a critical piece. And then the community aspect, the intergenerational community aspect. The reason why we put literacy in our freedom school conversation because we wanted to center that this literacy is a piece of it, but so is positive racial identity development. Because not only are these, and predominantly most of the people who go, when you're talking about like this elite group, most of them are white women. So most of this elite group who are teaching millions of kids, over half of them are Black and brown. Most of them who are delivering and leading these classrooms are white women. And so their mindset and their skill and their will to continuously improve is critical. But those same three components is absolutely important for all of us. But community teachers, if they are a part of the equation, if we look at communities have schools, and so then the schools are forced to interact in a respectful way with communities, partner with them with a level of cultural humility, then it erases that hyphen, it erases that chasm, and it actually extends, real partnerships in order to, do the critical work of educating the masses. We're talking about like over 50 million kids. That's just public school, let alone all the other types of schools, right? So I don't even know what the number, but like that's the entire future of this country. And I don't think we're a serious country. I just don't think we're serious. I think we're goofballs for the most part as a country. We're goofy, we're ignorant, we're goofy, and we're arrogant. That's a bad mix, that's a really bad mix.
Well, it's real funny you said those three descriptions. Most Def just had a freestyle over the like that beat, and he says those three words to describe America, right?
What?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm going to share it with you next time I see you.
Shout out to Most Def.
Yeah. I'm just going to leave with two quotes by educational theorists that should be read in every single, teacher prep class by Asa Hillard.
Yes.
When we confuse symptoms with problems, we will not be able to find a remedy, and we will squander scarce resources on meaningless activities. And this one, we need a massive mobilization of all of our resources towards the re-education of ourselves and those who will lead our children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, that one. That's about to become a blog post.
Yeah,
week.
I was about to say the same thing. I'm like,
you.
that's I got to share that with our apprentices, in Freedom School, because that's
brilliant.
Love it.
And I can tell you how many teacher prep programs even talk about Asa Hillard, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Know about, and not just white ones. There are HBCUs that you can go to and never come across Asa Hilliard's teachings.
Well, that will be a different show because we can come back to that one because that one's absolutely true, and I got a lot to say about that one. Well, listen, I appreciate you, brothers, for jumping on today. I actually think that literacy is something that we, the quote you just read, we do need a massive mobilization, but we have to target it at the things that have the biggest lever to pull, and literacy is that for me. Like when I say it's the gateway drug to all other learning, I think if we succeed in literacy, it has compounding interest over time. Like it will come back to us. The ROI on it is great. Hate to talk so business about it, but that is our business right now. We appreciate you guys for listening and watching and coming to the Freedom Friday show every week and sharing it with your friends. Please continue to share it with your friends and pass it all around. This has been another episode of Freedom Friday, and you're still not free, but hopefully you're free after this hour with Ish, Sharif, and me. Peace.